Hello, 1, 2, 3. All right. Hi guys, welcome to this video. My name is Jonathan Curtis and today I'm going to be talking about working as a professional musician. This is something I'm asked about a lot by my students and by people who contact me online. Maybe they've seen my YouTube channel or some of my musical releases or my book or whatever it may be, and they want advice, tips, pieces of information, insights into how to be a professional musician. What is it really like? What does it really take? How good do you need to be? That sort of thing. So in this video, I'm going to address as many things as I can from the realities of working in the music industry, how good you need to be, what it is like, what you can do, how I did it, the sort of work I do, and hopefully it will give you all a bit of advice, a bit of information, a bit of insight into what it's really like working in this music industry. And if those of you, if there are some of you who harbour similar ambitions, this might give you a bit of a leg up to get you started or might give you a bit of help or advice. So that's my goal with this. I want to just start by saying there is no set path. So I have a lot of friends and colleagues who work professionally in the music industry, and each of us have a different day-to-day life. Each of us have a different career. Each of us did it differently and do it differently. So what works for me and the way I do it may not necessarily be right for you, may not work for you, may not be applicable to you. So just bear that in mind. I'm going to share my own experiences and thoughts, but you need to just take that with a little bit of a pinch of salt because everybody's life is different. The first thing I want to talk about is about underestimating what it actually means to work in the music industry. I had somebody get in touch recently asking for advice, tips, that sort of thing, and they stated they were going to take a year out from university, a gap year, to make a go of it, right, to give it a go. And the first thing I had to say to this person was, a year is not going to do anything. If you think of a new business, when you set up a new business, you are always told to give it 3 to 5 years for it to become solvent. Being a professional musician is no different to being a professional anything else. You might be starting up a plumbing business, an electrician business, a builder's, an accountancy firm, whatever it may be. It is very unlikely that you're going to be anywhere near solvent in the first year, unless you are very experienced and you are sort of transferring across having already been a professional in that industry. So don't underestimate what being a professional, not just a musician, but being a professional actually means. So the first thing you will need to address is with regards to your legal status as a worker. Are you going to be self-employed? Are you going to be a company? Are you going to have your own company? Are you going to be employed by somebody? Are you going to employ others? These are all things that, like it or not, you have to consider, because wherever you are in the world, you are going to have to pay tax. As soon as you start earning money, you're going to start accruing a tax debt. The government, whatever your government is going to want some of your income. So it is your responsibility as a professional musician to be very aware of your legal status, your financial status. Are you self-employed? Do you do self-assessment? Are you a company, in which case you pay corporation tax? These are all things that are so easy to overlook, but absolutely 100% cannot be ignored. There is quite a famous interview, clinic, I can't remember specifically, but it's the drummer Chris Coleman, and he is talking a little bit about this. And he says, to be a drummer in this day and age, you also have to be a business person, which is absolutely true. I spend just as much time, if not more time, on the computer doing administrative tasks, spreadsheets, day-to-day admin like calendars, money, finances, accounting. These are all things that I didn't sign up for, but in order for me to sustain a career as a working musician, these are all things that I have to do regularly, and you will have to do this regularly as well. So don't underestimate what it actually takes to be a professional. There is so much more to it than simply getting a paid gig. But simply getting a paid gig is not going to be enough for you to turn professional. What you have to remember is that this is your livelihood. This is your way of life. This is your living. This is how you're going to pay your bills, your mortgage or your rent, whatever else it may be. So you can't take it lightly. This is not just step one to rock stardom, where you don't need to worry about all that stuff. Because in order to sustain a career, you absolutely have to worry about that stuff. When I first started, I was self-employed in the UK. I was classed as a sole trader, which essentially meant I worked for myself as an independent individual. A few years ago, I switched over to becoming a limited company because that made more sense with my portfolio. Because I've got musical releases and publications, the YouTube channel, as well as my teaching and other work, it made sense to sort of bring that all together into one company. So I pay corporation tax now instead of income tax, but essentially it's the same thing. It's still just me, but now legally I am a company as opposed to just an individual. But anyway, that doesn't matter. Being self-employed, being a sole trader is what most musicians are these days. You would be well advised to start researching, if you're in the UK, what these mean, sole trader or limited company, or wherever you are in the world, whatever it is in your country, that it means to be self-employed, because you're going to have to think about things like your bank account, your tax obligations, your accounting, that sort of thing. How good do you need to be? Well, this is an interesting one because I can't think of any other trade outside of the arts, at least, where this is a regular question. Imagine you're hiring a plumber. You don't hire a plumber based on how good they are. You hire a plumber based on whether or not they can do the job you need them to do. If you can do it yourself, you'll probably do it yourself. If you can't do it yourself, you're going to look for someone cheap, local and reliable who can do it. So you may have a leak in your sink. You're not going to look for the absolute best plumber in the world. You're probably not even going to look for the best plumber in your area. You're going to look for someone that's available, reliable, not too expensive, who's going to do a good job. Why should it be any different in the music industry, right? So for me, I have always strived to be as good as I can be on my instrument. But I know from experience that a lot of my work does not need a lot of the things I work on. So let's say I am hired to play a function gig on a Friday night. Maybe it's somebody's 50th birthday party, something like that. And the local band that has been hired has had their drummer pull out. They are given my number, they call me on the Thursday, I turn up and play on the Friday. That function band doesn't care how fast my hands are, how good my double strokes are, how clean my buzz rolls are. They don't care about my level of coordination. They don't care about my sight reading or my ability to play in odd time signatures. All they care about is, can I do a good job on the night, right? Can I play Superstition and make it sound like Superstition? Can I play Michael Jackson and keep a solid beat all the way through? These are what the people paying you are going to be caring about. Can you turn up on time? Is your equipment good enough to do the job? They don't care whether you're playing a Gretsch or a Pearl Export, right? They care about, is it going to be there at the right time? Is it going to fit into the space? And is it going to sound all right? That's it. So when you are asking yourself, am I good enough to be a professional musician? Stop thinking of that in terms of, am I the next Dave Weckl? Because the answer is no, you're not. I'm not. None of us are. Those people are not a benchmark for professional musicians. Those people are rightly some of the most famous drummers of all time because they are exceptionally good at their instrument. That is not the benchmark for being a working musician. Sure, strive to be that good. I do. I hope to be that good one day, and I'm sure all of you do as well. But that is a separate thing from making a living for yourself. Instead, ask yourself, am I good enough to do the job being offered? Because at the end of the day, that's what's going to pay your bills. So I'll give you a few examples here. This Friday night, I am playing a jazz gig at a local jazz club. It's my own trio, so I put the trio together. So I'm the one that corresponds with the venue, I'm the one that corresponds with the manager, and we're going to play, 10 till midnight, something like that on the late set. And I've played there numerous times before. I've played there numerous times before because on the first time I did a good job, so I get asked back to do it again. I am responsible for hiring the other musicians that are going to turn up and play. I am also responsible, if I make a pig's ear of it, if the band doesn't sound good, because I'm the one who arranged everything. I'm the one that the venue are not going to work with next time. So this is an instance where I am kind of in control. I got the gig. I sort out the band, I sort out the money at the end of the night, and it's my neck on the line. A few weeks ago, I had a job that was exactly as I just described. There was a function band playing a 50th birthday party. Their drummer couldn't do it. They were given my name, called upon me at short notice. I turned up and I did the gig. This is very common in that I'd never met the band before. There was no rehearsal. There was no get together beforehand or anything like that. I did get a set list, so I was able to prepare a little bit for the set, but essentially it was turn up, meet the band, play. I'm pretty good at that because I've done it hundreds of times. So I feel confident accepting that gig. One more, I used to do a lot of theatre work where I would sit in the theatre pit for a musical or a stage show, and I would read the conductor's score. So I would have all these lines of music, and I might have the bass part, the piano part, and the vocal part. And I would have to interpret what drums to play based on everything else, based on what the composer was doing. So they are 3 examples of jobs that I've had recently. You don't need to be able to play all of those jobs. You don't need to be able to play jazz. You don't need to be able to turn up and do a function set without any preparation. You don't need to be able to play a theatre show from the conductor's score only. But if I wasn't able to play jazz confidently, I wouldn't be able to take that gig. If I wasn't able to read music and interpret music, I wouldn't be able to take the theatre gig. I would be left with the function gig. And if I had no experience doing it without preparation, I wouldn't feel confident taking that gig. So as I've been hinting at, if you are good enough, what you are actually saying is, I feel confident taking those jobs. I feel confident saying yes to the jobs that come my way. The worst thing you can do, not just as a musician, but as any freelancer, is to say yes to a job and then cock it up, because you will suffer from a loss of reputation, which can really hinder you in the future. So let's say I took the last minute function gig and I turned up on the night and I made a pig's ear of it. Okay. The person that recommended me will never recommend me again. The band, not only will they never work with me again, they will make sure that anybody they know never works with me again. If my name comes up in conversation, they will say, no, don't work with him. We worked with him and he cocked it up. Anybody that sees me that night will not work with me again. They will probably not work with the whole band again. So there's a lot of knock-on effects for taking a job and doing it badly. It is far better to say, I am not the right person for this job. I've done this before. Somebody wanted a percussionist last minute for a theatre gig, and when they gave me the rundown, it needed pitched percussion, xylophones, timpani. Not only do I not have the equipment, I'm not confident playing them. So I had to say to them, yes, I'm a drummer, but I'm not the drummer you need for this gig. You need an orchestral percussionist. I'm not an orchestral percussionist. And yes, I lost the gig. I lost out on whatever that gig paid. And frankly, that musical director probably won't ever approach me again. However, everybody's reputation is intact. I didn't lead them on. I didn't take them down the road saying, yes, I can do it, and then pull out at the last minute. And I didn't take the gig and then turn up and do a bad job. So what I'm really getting at here is, if you think of all the ways you're going to be making money as a professional musician, you need to be confident taking those jobs. Are you confident if a jazz gig comes your way? Are you confident if a function or a wedding comes your way? Would you take the gig for a theatre show? Would you take on new students? Would you take on students who want to do grades? Would you take on students who want to do Latin? These are the things that are going to be paying your bills. So you need to be confident accepting those jobs. If you can't play jazz, that's okay. It doesn't mean you can't be a professional musician, but it means you're going to be turning down every jazz gig. If you can't sight read, that's okay. Doesn't mean you can't be a working musician, but you're going to have to turn down any job that requires sight reading. So you are hindering yourself. You're shooting yourself in the foot. Obviously, there is a bottom line as to how good you need to be. You would expect somebody who claims to be a professional to be of a certain standard. You would expect somebody to be very, very good. and you would expect not to be a professional musician if you weren't very good. You can't just be a professional musician because you're pretty good at your instrument and you don't want to get a real job and you've got ambitions and you've got dreams to be a rock star. Being a professional does have certain responsibilities, and it does require a basic level, a minimum level of how good you are. So if I were to encounter another professional musician, let's say another professional drummer, I would expect them to be able to play, right? I would expect to be able to watch them and go, yeah, that's cool. You know what you're doing. If you are not very good, it is going to come back to you. So my bottom line, as I've said all along, in order to consider yourself good enough to be a professional musician, think about any opportunities that might come your way. Would you feel confident accepting them? If the answer is mostly yes, that's a good sign. If the answer is mostly no, well, I'm not really confident enough to play jazz. I wouldn't do a theatre show because I'm not very good at reading. I could probably do a wedding if it's mainly pop and rock stuff. I could do a blues gig, but as long as there's rehearsal. These are indications that you may not be quite ready yet. Now, one thing I will say, I'm 31 now. I started doing this professionally when I was about 24. And I think I've improved in the past 5 years more than any time since I was a beginner because I've been working. I've been doing it. When I first started out at 24, I was pretty good, right? I'd been around the block. I'd got my grade 8 for those of you in the UK. I could sight read pretty well. I could play all styles pretty well. But it wasn't until I was out getting the gigs and doing the shows night after night, week after week, racking up the experience that I really started to realize how good I could be. And these days, I'm not the best drummer in the world. I still strive to be, but I'm not the best drummer in the world. But because of my experience, because of the jobs I've done, and because of what I've learned and continue to work on, I feel I am very well placed as a professional. I very, very rarely turn down work. I very rarely have to turn down work. So I believe I'm now at a stage where I am good enough to be a professional musician. At 24, honestly, I probably wasn't. But it was by taking that leap and starting out anyway that made me good enough later on. I am far better now than I was at 24. But at 24, I was taking jobs that I could do. I didn't take the jazz gigs because no jazz gigs came my way. Once I started looking for the jazz gigs, once I started getting embedded in the scene, my jazz got better. So then I got more jazz gigs. So I would accept more jazz gigs and my jazz got better again. And nowadays, however good I may be at jazz, I am as good as I am because of all the work I've put into it, but also because of all the jazz gigs I've done. This brings me on to opportunities. A lot of freelance work, musicians or otherwise, rely on opportunities coming your way. We've all heard the stories of luck, being in the right place at the right time, being noticed, this sort of thing. And there is always an element of that. You are always going to find yourself getting work out of the blue because you just happen to be the right person at the time. You were in the right place at the right time. I've got stories of that happening, as has everyone else. But what I've found is that work breeds work and opportunities breed opportunities. So as I talked about earlier, my next gig is this Friday night jazz gig where I am the instigator of it. That came about, somebody else on the scene who was a regular piano player had my name through a friend of a friend. I was known vaguely as some drummer who could play jazz. She got in touch with me completely out the blue one night, called me up or messaged me or something, and said, I need a drummer for this Friday night at the jazz club. Can you do it? Last minute, I'm desperate. And I said, yeah, sure, why not? She then said, great. You need to provide a band because my entire trio are unavailable. So I was like, right, great, okay. So I quickly ran around and I put together a bass player and a keyboard player and we turned up on the night and I introduced myself to the landlord, the manager, and I said, you're expecting such and such. Sorry, you've got me. Hope that's okay. And they shrugged and said, well, as long as you play jazz, I don't care. We played that gig. It went well. The manager came up to me afterwards and said, so do I deal with you then? And I shrugged and said, yeah, why not? And he said, okay, here's a list of dates for the rest of the year. What do you think? And I said, yeah. Many years later, I'm still playing there. I'm the one that corresponds with the manager, blah, blah, blah. Some of you may know, over the past few years, I've released various albums. These in themselves have gone on to get me work. So I dug into my own pocket. I paid for studio time. I paid for session musicians. I wrote material myself. I filmed it all. It was released commercially. Nowadays, I am able to use that as part of my portfolio so that people who are looking for a drummer, I can just say, well, look, here's what I've already done. That's me. And they are able to say, wow, you must know what you're doing. You look like you know what you're doing. And they were able to give me a job. So there are real instances where I have gained work through my past work. My portfolio has given me work that I wouldn't otherwise have got. This brings me on to what I'm going to call a portfolio career. This is the way I operate. As I say, I know plenty of people who work as musicians who do not operate in this way, but this is the way I operate, what's called a portfolio career. And it essentially means I work on lots of different projects that all accrue into revenue streams. So as I said, I've released numerous albums. I've released a book. I make YouTube videos like this one. I teach. I do freelance work, I gig, I record. Each individual piece of that is probably too small to make a proper living. I probably don't do quite enough teaching to make a full living just from teaching. I don't do enough gigging to make a living just from gigging. I don't do enough session work to make a living from just session work. I don't sell enough albums or books to retire to Miami. However, all of those things combined create revenue streams. They create a wage. They create a balance at the end of the month or at the end of the year. So when I look back through my accounts, I can see, oh, I made this much from books. I made this much from album sales. I made this much from teaching, gigging, whatever else. So everything I do is an attempt to add to my portfolio, which then makes me money. Okay, so when I wrote Linear Freedom, I was doing it evenings and weekends for free. Right? I wasn't getting paid for it. I hadn't been commissioned for it. I had absolutely no guarantee that I was even going to finish it, yet let alone ever make any money on it. But I really wanted to do it, and I did finish it, and I did take it to publication. It is published. It is now selling. So now, for the rest of my life, Linear Freedom is going to sell. Maybe in small volumes, maybe hopefully one day in large volumes, but that's going to sell for the rest of my life. And I now don't need to do anything. The only thing I ever need to do is distribute them as they sell. So this is an element of my portfolio that is now finished. It's ticked off. The work has already been done. And I'm now, for the rest of my career, for the rest of my life, reaping the rewards of that. Likewise with the music. Likewise with the videos. Let's say this video goes on to reach 100,000 views. That'd be great, right? I'm doing the work now on a Tuesday afternoon. No one's paying me to do this. I am not otherwise working. You know, there's no one here, there's no student outside waiting to come and have a lesson with me. So I am essentially doing this for free. But once it's finished, maybe 100,000 people will watch it and I will accrue advertising revenue. That will also increase my, if you like, reputation or online presence or fame or whatever you want to call it. That means somebody will go and search out my book, go and search out my music, come to me for lessons. So this is a very small example of another aspect of my portfolio, which then accrues and becomes part of the greater whole. So this portfolio career, which I would encourage anybody to consider, essentially relies on the principle that you do the work in the first instance, and then you sell that work for the rest of your career. This speculate to accumulate, right? I did the work on the book up front. However many hundreds of hours it took me, that was unpaid. Now for the rest of my career, I'm reaping those benefits because that's now my asset, my product that I can sell for the rest of my career. Likewise with the music. I spent however many thousands of pounds recording my first album, but I'm now going to be selling that album, touring that album, gigging that album for the rest of my career. All right. Each of those things advertise each other because somebody might see my album and really like my drumming, hopefully, and then say, oh, this guy's got a book. I'm going to buy that book because I like his music. Or vice versa. They may read my book, think, hey, this guy's really cool. I love his drumming. Is there anywhere I can hear him play? Oh, look, he's got an album out. So everything is a holistic kind of melting pot of everything I've done. Everything feeds into everything else. That's not the only way. There are people who work in the industry that just work job to job. They teach regularly, they gig regularly, they're well known, they're well entrenched in the circuit, and that's that. And that's absolutely fine, right? They do it. They're making a living. They're out there playing the drums or playing their instrument for a living. For me, I always like to be working on something, but what you really have to look at is, where is my money coming from? Remember, as we were talking about, don't underestimate how much work you're going to need to do to actually make a living, right? So let's say you have just graduated music college or whatever it is, you've just lost your job somewhere else and you think, right, now's the time to become a professional musician. Well, if you say, okay, I need to make X amount per month to pay the bills, to pay the rent, to feed myself. How do I earn X amount per month? How many gigs is that? How many students is that? How many recording sessions is that? How many album sales is that? How many book sales is that? Well, you might not have a book out. You might not have any album releases. You might not have any students. Are you reliant entirely on the gigs? So this comes back to what I was talking about right at the start about how good you need to be. How many jobs can you say yes to? Because if you are a really, really, really good jazz drummer, your speciality is jazz, well, you're going to need an awful lot of jazz gigs every week to pay your rent at the end of the month. Whereas if you've got a few jazz gigs, but you've also got a dozen students, and you've also got a new video out that's doing the rounds, and you've also sold a few books, well, suddenly there's a lot less pressure on you to get that extra jazz gig and to go and work on a Tuesday night or a Sunday afternoon, whenever the jazz gigs are. But you need to be looking at where your revenue is going to come from. So this guy that contacted me recently, he said, and I hate to use you as an example, you know who you are, but I hate to use you as an example, but it's actually a really good example. He said he couldn't read music. He had no knowledge of theory, no knowledge of harmony, no knowledge of music theory on the whole outside of basic drumming theory. He said he couldn't play jazz. He said he wasn't good enough to write a book. Well, this is where you start to ask yourself, where am I actually going to get my money from? How am I actually going to make any money doing this? If I've got no products to sell, if I'm not good enough to play jazz, I'm not going to get any jazz gigs. I'm really good at funk. I'm really good at metal. Well, there's no money in metal for a start. As much as I love it, there's no money in it. If you're not good enough to read, you're not going to get any theatre work, and you probably shouldn't be teaching either. This is where you've got to say to yourself, well, where am I actually going to get any money from? Where are my jobs coming? So the advice I gave to this guy was, don't be disheartened. He was only young. He was only 20 or something. Just keep working. Keep studying. Keep gaining experience. Try and make a few contacts in the local scene and take it from there. There is no rush, because it's going to take you years and years to establish yourself. This brings me to another issue of the timing, right? I was very lucky because before I turned professional, I was doing a master's degree, not in music, right? I was doing something completely different. I was doing a master's degree, and my girlfriend at the time, my now wife, were living with my parents, because she had moved over from Australia. For those that don't know, I'm married to an Australian. She had moved across from Australia and was finishing her degree. I was working on a master's degree, and we had all sorts of visa stuff going on. So we were living with my parents, which essentially meant rent-free, bills-free. Now, we did contribute a little bit, and we always offered, but we had no financial commitments. So I was able to start putting feelers out and getting a bit of work, expanding my reputation a little bit without any desperate need to make money immediately. I could take my time with it. And by the time we moved out, by the time we bought a house and moved to where we are now, I had already been doing it a few years and already had some more regular work. I think one of the difficulties is needing it straight away. You may have just lost your job doing something else and you need revenue now, right? You need an income because you've got bills to pay, mouths to feed, whatever else. The reality is you are probably not going to have the time to build up that career before those bills come knocking. And what a lot of people will do will transition slowly from their regular job into this industry, and they will drop the regular job once the musical work picks up. But that can take years. That may never happen. So some people work on this line. Half the time they're professional musicians. The other half the time they're whatever else. They're waiters. They're employees of some other business. Again, that's great. But what you sometimes find is you become a slave to the wage, where you rely so much on the wage from your regular job that you become lackadaisical with your musical work. You stop practicing, you stop being desperate for it, you stop being hungry, and you're tired at the end of the day, so you don't want to practice and all this sort of thing. But ultimately, and this is the biggest hurdle, I think, for any aspiring professional musician, you need to give yourself time to break into the industry. It's, as I say, I'm 31 now. I started when I was 24. So that's about 7 years, 6.5 years. It has taken me all that time to get to where I am now, which is somewhat financially stable and independent. And I am very, very pleased to say that in the past 6 or 7 years, I have not done a single job for money that was not drumming or musical related. Every penny I've earned in the last 6 or 7 years has been through music, which I'm incredibly proud of. But be under no illusions that in that time I've had low wages, I've had very unstable income, I've missed bill payments, right? I've not had any income tax to pay because I was below the threshold. There's all these things that you have to go through in order to get to the stage where I am now, where I'm making pretty decent money pretty regularly. So, how do you get started? This is probably the single most common question I am asked, because it is very easy for me to sit here now and talk about all the gigs I've got coming up, all the students I've got, the musical releases and the books and whatever else. It's very easy for me to sit here now and tell you about those. If you are in my situation 10 years ago, where you are desperate to be a working musician, but you are currently absolutely nowhere, how the hell do you get started? It is really, really difficult to know what to do, to even know what the first step is. You can feel like not only are you knocking at a door and no one's answering, you don't even know which door to start knocking on. You don't even know which street the house is on. So this is I'm talking to you now, you people who feel you don't even know how to get started. You've probably all heard the phrase, it is not about who you know, it is about who knows you. Well, that is absolutely true. Nobody or very few people get jobs through advertising themselves. I never, ever, ever post on Facebook, pro drummer available, call me for a session, because it just doesn't happen. It never happens. I don't think I've ever got work other than teaching. Because I teach from my own studio, I advertise in the local area. But for actual like gigs, recording sessions, things like that, I've never got work through advertising myself. 100% of the drumming work I've received comes from people who know me and have been recommended me. Okay, so it is quite common. I will get an email or a phone call saying, hello, is this Jonathan? I've been given your number by such and such, and I need a drummer for this gig. That is how I get 100% of my work. No, that's probably how I get all 100% of my new work. A lot of the repeat work comes from doing a good gig the first time and then that leading to other work. But 100% of my new work comes from word of mouth, comes from reputation. Maybe somebody has seen my YouTube video. Maybe someone has heard my album somewhere. Maybe somebody has been given my phone number as a recommendation. Maybe somebody saw me play a different gig and came up to me afterwards. These are all real situations that do happen. So the first thing you need to do is start exploring your local scene, because if you are living in the middle of nowhere and the only gigging venue for 100 miles around is just one local pub that has music on a Sunday evening, realistically, you're going to have a hard time. at least in the first instance, right? At least to get started. Assuming you are somewhere relatively built up with a relatively thriving social scene, you need to start scouting out where the venues are. Where does music take place, right? Where are the musicians for these gigs coming from? Who are they? Why don't I know about them? Who are they? Why aren't I friends with them? Are there jam sessions? Are there open mic nights? Things like that. You've all heard the platitudes. You've all heard these stereotypical answers. But unfortunately, if nobody knows you are available, nobody's going to give you work. It is as simple as that. Now, here is a thought experiment you can conduct that may help you see what I mean. Let's say you are a producer. You are the person with all the power. You've got a studio and a record label and an artist, and you're putting together a new album, and you need a drummer, right? You're in charge of the budget. You're in charge of finding the musicians and the personnel and hiring them and blah, blah, blah. You're the producer, okay? You have a studio session booked for the weekend and everything is in place except the drummer. Who do you use? Think really, really realistically, practically about who you know, either personally or otherwise, and how you would go about hiring a drummer. Now, your first instance is going to be to think about who you know personally. You may have a friend, a brother, a cousin, a co-worker, a friend of a friend, somebody you've seen once at the local gig venue, who you know plays the drums. If they are the only drummer you can even think of that you know personally, well, that's who you're going to turn to, right? That's the person you're going to call and say, hey, I need a drummer, can you do it? Failing that, what would you do? Google search? Ask your friends? Word of mouth? Would you put an advert out in a newspaper? Because this is where you need to start placing yourself, right? So if your answer was, well, I would call the drummer that I saw at the venue last Friday night, well then, how do you become the drummer at that venue on a Friday night? If you would ask your local drum center, well, you need to go and be the person that your local drum center would recommend. If you would ask your friend's drum teacher, well, you need to be your friend's drum teacher, right? The point is, whatever answer you came up with as to how you would think of hiring the drummer if it were you in charge, you need to then go and make yourself be in that position. If your last resort was, well, hell, I'd Google it. If you're in Nottingham and I would go and Google Nottingham session drummer, right? It's unlikely anybody would do that. But if that's your last resort, well, you need to make it so that when somebody Googles Nottingham session drummer, it's your name at the top. All right. Now, as I've said, realistically, if you're in that position as a producer, you probably know 10,000 drummers. So you're not going to be Googling Nottingham drummer. But if that was your answer, somebody else is going to have that same answer someday. So you need to make it your mission that your website comes up when somebody Googles Nottingham session drummer, right? Now, I don't know that mine does, to be honest with you. I can't remember. I'm not very good at analytics and metadata and stuff like that, because I've never got a session gig through somebody Googling my website. All of my session gigs come from word of mouth, but you have to start somewhere. I can tell you the first session gig I ever got was through my music teacher at the time. The second one was from a word of mouth. Somebody emailed me out the blue and said, I've been given your name by such and such. So really, that is your number one priority. Entrench yourself in the local scene, meet people, make it known that you operate as a drummer or whatever your instrument, because sooner or later, somebody will need a drummer and they will think of you. You may be bottom of the list. That's fine, as long as you're on that list. I've got gigs before where I've been like the 8th person they've asked. They don't know me very well. They've never worked with me before. They've tried all their first call guys. And then eventually the friend of a friend of a friend has said, oh, try this guy. And they've found their way to me. So over the course of your career development, you will place yourself on as many people's lists as you can. Get yourself known to them, and eventually they will contact you for work. Another thing you can do when you're first starting out is to try and produce something. I think the most valuable things I've ever done have been to make something. So when I was a complete unknown. Nobody or very few people knew me, very few people worked with me. One of the first things I did was make an album. All right. I wrote music. I hired the studio. I hired the session musicians out of my own pocket, right? And I found suddenly I was elevated to this position of somebody that actually does something. There are so many people milling around who say they're musicians and say they're this, but they don't actually do anything. I was an unknown quantity, but I actually dug into my own pocket and I paid people, I created work, and I produced something. There was an end product that is now available commercially. So I went from being an unknown to a producer, right? A record producer. These days, I now release stuff under my own record label because I founded a company, because I founded a record label and a publishing company for my book, all because of that first step of writing my own music and producing my own record. So one of the most valuable things you can do is actually create your own work. You may be a fantastic graphic designer. Well, create a poster for yourself, for your teaching work, right? You may be an amazing composer. Well, compose something. Doesn't matter if you have to pay someone else to record it for you. Get it done. Get it made. You may be a fantastic presenter. Buy a cheap camera, buy a microphone and record a YouTube video. Just get producing something that can start adding to your credits, to your back catalogue, to your repertoire, to your portfolio. Finally, I'm just going to share with you a few case studies of my own personal experience that will hopefully highlight some of the ins and outs. As I said, one of the hardest things is starting out, knowing how to find work in the first place. Case study number 1, the jazz scene. I'm known relatively locally as a jazz drummer, which basically means people are willing to offer me jazz gigs if they need it. The other people playing jazz on the scene will call me if they need somebody. I'm just known as somebody who can do a jazz gig. It doesn't mean I'm fantastic or amazing at jazz. It just means I'm known as somebody that can do a jazz gig. I play jazz relatively regularly for money. I'm paid for it. And I'm confident enough that I write my own jazz music and I release my own jazz music and I teach jazz. About 7 years ago, right at the start of my career, when I'd never played jazz before, I'd been playing in a metal band. I'd recorded with a metal band for years, and I wanted to start playing jazz and getting into jazz. So I bought myself John Riley's Art of Bop Drumming, started studying that, and I did exactly what I said I wouldn't do, and I Googled Nottingham Jazz, and I just thought, I'll see what comes up. And there were various local artists and venues and things like that. And then there was something called the Nottingham Jazz Workshop, which was, and to my knowledge still is, a group of people, hobbyists, who would get together on a Wednesday evening at a local pub and they would play jazz. They would just play standards from the real book, and that would be it. That would be their Wednesday evening. It was just for fun. They weren't particularly good. I hope you guys won't mind me saying that. They weren't particularly good. It was for mutual improvement and enjoyment. I called them and I said, can I come along one day? And they said, yeah, sure. What do you play? And I said, drums. And they said, oh, fantastic. We've been needing a drummer for ages. So I went along to this Wednesday evening thing. I didn't know anybody there, but the room was packed. There was a piano player, there was a bass player, a number of singers, and then a number of sax players and trumpets. And they basically said, okay, let's just start with whatever it was, Autumn Leaves or something like that. And the leader counted us in, and I just played a basic swing beat, da, 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 because that's all I knew how to do. And I played along to Autumn Leaves. And they took turns, they sang the verse, then they did the solos, then they sang the head, and then that was job done. And then we did Summertime, and then we did blah, 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 and then we did whatever else. And then we might have done Girl for Ipanema. So I did a simple boom, 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 boom. I did a bossa, right? And because that's all I knew how to do, Latin jazz, I thought I'd do a bossa, jazz samba, something like that. And it went pretty well. And I thought, hey, and I went for a week or two. And then by about the third week, the piano player came over to me and he said, we've got a gig next week and we need a drummer. Do you want to do it? And quite honestly, it spiraled from there because I said yes. and we did the gig. And then we got more gigs, and I was building up confidence. However many years later, I'm playing jazz. So that entire aspect of my career started because I just went along one night to this, essentially a jam session, a jazz jam session. And I sat in, and that was that. I'll give you another case study. Many years ago, I can't remember what year it was now, but I did all of the drums. There's a drummer called Mike Dolbear. He's a British drummer, and he has an app out called Rhythm and Fills, like a smartphone app or something. I did all of the drum recording for that app. So any of you who have got that app and you play a drumming example, that's me playing it. I got that through my teacher at the time. I went to a local music school and said to them very specifically, I want to get my grade 8. I was about 23 at the time, 22, 23, and I said, I want to get my grade 8. And I became kind of the star student of this guy because I was aiming for a high thing. I'm not saying I was better than every other student or anything like that, but we kind of developed a bond because my teacher knew that I was really keen and working towards something. He knew I wanted to be a professional. He knew I was aiming for a high level. And I was having lessons with him for however many years, and he just called me up out the blue one day and said, do you want a session? And I was like, yeah, what is it? And he said, well, it's the app for Mike Dolbear. He's doing an app and he needs some drums recording. It's going to take like 8 hours to do all these examples and I haven't got the time. Do you want it? And I was like, yeah. And he goes, the pay's all right, but it will look better on your portfolio. So the next week I was in the studio and I did like 200 audio examples, playing the drums, recording it, producing it. And that was my first ever recording session. But I was then able to put that on my credit list so that anybody else looking at me can say, oh, well, this guy's done this. Just to recap what has been a bit of a rambling session, a bit of a rambling video. Don't underestimate what it means to be a professional musician. You have to treat it like any other business. You have a product and a service to sell. It doesn't matter whether that product is teaching, whether it's musical production, whether it's educational material, or just simply freelancing it. You are selling products and services. The fact that they are musical in nature doesn't matter. So don't ignore the business aspect. Are you going to be a sole trader or a limited company, whatever else? You don't need to be a virtuoso. You will need to be good, right? No two ways about it. The better you are at all aspects of your instrument, the more jobs you are going to be able to accept. It doesn't matter if you can't play jazz. It doesn't exclude you from being a professional musician. But it just so happens that near to me, there is a pretty healthy jazz scene that pays well. So if you can't play jazz, that's an area that you're going to have to miss out on. It's just work that you are going to have to ignore for the time being. So when thinking about how good you need to be, think about the jobs you are going to be able to say yes to. The more jobs you can say yes to, the more work you'll have. Simple as that. A lot of opportunity comes from knowing people who is going to know you in order to recommend you or call on you or think of you. The more work you get, the more work it will lead to. So it will start slowly and it will snowball and blossom from that. So try and introduce yourself to the local scene, try and sit in, try and get entrenched so that people simply know about you. When the work comes along, you might be 10th on the list, but if the other 9 people can't do it, quid's in. Then you need to be in a position to make sure you are able to do a good job when you get that opportunity so that they think of you first next time. This is a really important one. Make your own opportunities, right? Don't be afraid to go out and do something, because that will be far better than being too scared and not producing anything. I have hosted things where barely anybody turned up. I've hosted gigs that didn't really work. I've released things that were unknown and unheard of, but I've done it. I've put my hand into my own back pocket, I've spent the money, I've done the work, and I've created stuff. For better or for worse, I've created things, my own body of work. And that has been far more valuable to me than anything else. So don't be afraid to make your own opportunities. You become the one that is producing the work rather than the one that's always looking for work. I hope this has been somewhat beneficial to you. I know there's a lot of rambling going on, but it's a big topic and I wanted to try and cover as many points as I can. Please feel free to get in touch with any other specific questions if you have ambitions to work in the music industry. If you are just getting started, you want some advice or anything like that. Don't make the mistake of thinking working in the music industry is being a rock star, right? Working in the music industry is the same as working in any other industry. You have products and services to sell. You need to be in a position to sell them. It is that simple. Good luck. Have fun with it. Stay in touch. I hope to hear from you and see you on the next video. Cheers, guys.